I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You are the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
I did it again. Welcome to Life Today Live. I need to unmute my mic before I start talking. That's the way it goes. I'm Randy Robinson, and great to be here with you guys again. A couple years ago, I interviewed a gentleman named Andrew Klavan. He's with the Daily Wire, which is my daily coffee mug kind of thing. And I enjoy the Daily Wire. And if you are there as well, you've possibly seen Andrew Klavan's son, Spencer Klavan, or at least heard Andrew talking about it. And he joins me today. He's got a book. And man, I got to tell you, this is one of these books that sometimes I read, a paragraph over, because it's good. It's really good and detailed and deep. And it talks about science and faith and a lot of the history of kind of how we got to this place. So we're going to talk about that because it's one of those ongoing things, I think, with Christians, especially in the church, in the culture. And we've kind of put the two at odds, and maybe it shouldn't be that way. This is the book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, available wherever you get books. Again, written by Spencer Klavan, who's also the host of the Young Heretics podcast, and he joins us. Spencer, welcome to Life Today Live.
Randy, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So before we get to the book, I have this burning question, because having listened to your father for many years, and I love his sense of humor. it's kind of off and warped like mine, so it works. But he always introduces you as Spencer Klavan, no relation. And I'm just curious what it feels like to be publicly and repeatedly disowned by your own father.
Oh, it's for my sake, not his. He'd be happy to be associated with me. This is a gag that I don't know if you've ever seen, if you're a fan of The Simpsons, but on The Simpsons, Sideshow Bob is this character that wants to kill Bart. And he is sort of an evil genius, but he's also a doofus, and he keeps stepping on rakes, and the rake comes up and it smacks him in the face. Right. And Matt Groening, who created The Simpsons, has an interview somewhere where he talks about this gag because it happens once, it's very funny. It happens again, it's kind of funny. And then Groening says, you go through a trough where it just stops being funny, and the whole audience is like, stop doing this gag. It's just so tight. But then if you push through, says Groening, if you really just commit and you don't stop doing the same joke, it actually gets funny again, because it's funny that you're still telling it. So I think we've reached the trough, and we've just started, we're on the upswing there with this joke that I'm not related to my dad.
You pushed through. I still laugh every time.
There you go.
So
all right.
You've reached that point. All right. So, light of the mind, light of the world, science, faith, reason, Christianity, all these things. How do we get to the point where the two in the culture have been positioned really at odds? Because it's almost like, do you have faith, or do you believe in science? And I don't know how we got here.
Well, I'm really very pleased to report that we can blame the French. It's always a great day when you can do that. I'm only joking a little bit. I really liked what you said, that this is an ongoing thing for Christians. It's been hanging in the air ever since I was a little kid. For as long as I can remember growing up in school, there was this ambient idea, and it's almost not even an idea. It's like more of a vibe or a feeling that smart people aren't religious and religious people aren't smart, or that these two things are in conflict with each other, right? And, I was a brainy kid. I was interested in school. I liked school a lot. But I also, over the course of my high school career, I came to believe in God, which I wasn't raised a Christian, but I came to become a Christian by the end of high school. And this really bothered me. It bothered me that there was an assumption that in converting to Christianity, I had just totally lost the plot, or was just shelving my brain. Like my brain was going over here, and especially science, especially I was denying science. And this is kind of what got me interested in this narrative. And it is a narrative, and it emerged really out of the Enlightenment, which is this period sort of right after the scientific revolution. We all learned in school about Galileo and Isaac Newton and all these guys. And maybe we were told a kind of story that those guys were for reason, against the evil church. It was the nasty, mean church that wanted to keep human reason from discovering science. And not only is that totally wrong, it's very much not how Isaac Newton and Galileo themselves would have seen it. They were believing Christians of one variety or another, as was Johannes Kepler, as were all of these big names that we talk about. And they thought that in doing science, they were obeying God because they were coming to know him through their rational minds, which God had given them. God gives us our reason. He makes the world so that we can understand it. And I believe he does that so that we can know him through it, through our reason, in part. There's other ways, of course, but that's one way. And in the wake of that, after that happened, you have this movement called the Enlightenment, which basically takes science and says this proves that we don't need God to understand the world because human reason alone can chart out the pattern of the stars, can figure out all these ancient questions people have been puzzling over forever. And they developed this narrative. I mean, the very word enlightenment is a kind of press campaign. It's a kind of PR move to say there was darkness and then there was light. And the idea of the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages kind of comes out of this same sort of idea. And the joke about it is that it's a profoundly unscientific idea. It's an anti-scientific idea because in order to do science, you actually have to believe there's something bigger than the human mind that creates us and that puts us here to understand the whole world. It's very audacious to think we can understand the world unless we are products of the same mind that created everything. And so the book, this book is basically a hard reset on the whole narrative because I really think it's long past due that we take a look at this again. And I tell the story from the ancient Greeks all the way down to the modern day in quantum physics and just show that, religion came, or science came out of religion. It did get claimed as a kind of atheist talking point, but it never really fit that way. And now, especially in the last 100 years with quantum physics and some of this really cutting edge stuff, it's not only does science kind of not refute religion, you might actually need religion. You might actually need Judeo-Christian scripture to understand what we're discovering about the world. And so that's the book.
One of the things that you talk about that I thought was very interesting was the idea of this, the word cosmos meaning order.
Yeah.
And, without order, there's no life, there's no earth. And, how do we get order out of chaos? And if there is order, then that allows science to even work because you can, do the scientific process and replicate things and get the same results every time and prove things. How does order play into both God and science?
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on that point because, we throw the word cosmos around now. Maybe people saw the Carl Sagan show back in the day, or this is what we think of as like space and telescopes and all that.
Billions of years ago. Yes.
Right. We are star stuff. Yeah, I totally watched that as a kid. I loved that show. And and now Neil deGrasse Tyson is kind of the modern version of that, right? And he says similar stuff. But cosmos, the idea of the cosmos, it's actually the same Greek root where we get our word cosmetics. So you think about a woman putting on makeup, that's cosmetics, and it's applying order to her face, right? It's sort of shaping up, right? And sometimes. It's the same idea. So, yeah, exactly. If it's done well. Other times, perhaps, like not so much. But yeah, so cosmeo in Greek, it means to kind of put something in order, to order things. So the cosmos is something that has a logical structure. And in ancient Greece, this logical structure was called the logos, right? It was where we get our word logic. So this was a logic or a mind that just put everything together in order. And that idea that the universe is ordered gets you like halfway to modern science because it suggests that there's something out there that can be understood, that if we could pull back the camera and see the whole thing, we could get a God's eye view of the world and we could understand the order. But it doesn't actually get you all the way because we don't have that God's eye view, right? We are living in this little tiny corner of the world and we can't pull our camera back unless we have like a little mini picture in our minds that corresponds to the grand order in the universe. In other words, we have to have the logos in us if we're going to understand the logos out there.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the very first line of John's gospel,
John.
right? In the beginning was the word, right? So that claim, which, we all know maybe from, if you go to church, that line, but you don't necessarily realize that's like a major philosophical claim.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning was the logos. Harkens right back to the book of Genesis, where God makes man in his own image. But it also answers, it gives you the other half of what Greek philosophy is kind of missing. It says, yes, there's logos in the world, there's order in the heavens, but that same order is imprinted on us. And, when God became incarnate in man, he sort of affirmed that by the logos taking on human flesh. And that picture, once you put those two things together, then you have the recipe for science. It's that idea that enables Isaac Newton to have the absolute gall, the audacity, the sheer audacity on this man to think, like, maybe if I watch apples falling from trees and billiard balls moving across tables, I can use that same logic to explain like nebular dust, right? and Saturn, why did he think he could do that? Well, because he was steeped in this theology, which is what it is. It's a philosophical theology that says your brain's not just an evolutionary product designed to help you like ward off lions and jackals. It's also a blueprint for the whole universe.
So do you think it'd be fair to translate John 1:1 as in the beginning was the order, and the order was with God, and the order was God?
It's so funny. Thomas Jefferson kind of wanted to do something almost exactly like that. He wrote that the whole history of Christianity would be different if instead of word, we had translated logos as reason. And this is, to me, an interesting thought. I think that we certainly can see a lot of fascinating, wonderful things about the Christian tradition if we emphasize that logos isn't just like the spoken words that you and I are speaking now, because we can get confused if we think like, what is the word? What was the word? Was it cantaloupe? Was it like
the Bible? I've literally heard it preached in the beginning was the Bible, and I was like, wait, what?
Right. Yeah, and I think that the problem, but also the beauty, and people like me that get nerdy about languages, this is one of my favorite hobby horses, right? The beauty and the problem is that basically any translation is too small.
Yeah,
and I think that like that's true of translating it as Bible. It's true of translating it as reason as well, because then we think about our own limited human understanding and our equations. But we're really talking about the thing that those equations refer to outside of us, like the whole created order. So you really kind of have to hold this thing up to a bunch of different angles. There are, I think, Jews who believe that yes, the Talmud or the Torah or some combination is kind of uncreated, right? That it's like that's there in the beginning. But I would say that like what I like about the idea of the word is that it's something very commonplace, right? We use words all the time. It's almost a definitional part of who we are. And if you think about the fact that we do that we can use language, it actually is a miraculous component of this reason, right? That we have reason inside of us. We can speak and use language. And so it brings it down like into the bones of what we are. And so I'm a big King James stan for a lot of reasons, but that's one of them. I actually think word ends up being a really good translation.
And it's the spoken word, is language that brings order to societies in a lot of ways.
Yes.
That's an interesting thing. All right. So the subtitle, A Light of the Mind, Light of the World, the subtitle is Illuminating Science Through Faith, which is an interesting take. And you touched on it, you hinted at it. Do you actually think that you're better off in the field of science, more capable of understanding the science, the order of the world, when you believe that there is someone who has ordered it?
Yeah, the subtitle is a provocation, no question. It's kind of a come at me, bro subtitle, because the typical thing, and I think we did talk about this with my publisher, the typical thing was illuminating faith through science.
Exactly.
Things discovered with science can help you to understand kind of what the Bible is talking about. And I'm not against that. I'm actually for it. I think it's kind of in the St. Augustine talks about sort of similar things that you can use the book of nature and hold it up against the book of scripture. But I do really want to make a more countercultural claim here, a more audacious claim. And that is that we have this picture of science as this freestanding, perfect temple, right? That doesn't need any support from anything else. We can just look at the world and we can just understand it with math. That's kind of the basic everyman's idea, I think, of science. But philosophers of science and practitioners of science, if you talk to them, will all tell you that's actually not true. And Francis Bacon, who's credited with inventing kind of what became the scientific method, writes about this a lot and worries over it. He says there's no such thing really as like raw sense data or raw observation, what the Greeks called empiria, or experience, where we get our word empirical knowledge, right? That never comes to you raw. We don't just have direct sense experiences. We always look through glasses at the world. We have a theory that interprets. I don't just see a splotch of brown against the blue of the sky. I see a bird, right? And my mind interprets that. And we can never, ever get away from that. And so what I'm proposing in this book is that the modern discoveries of science, which, like all discoveries of science, need interpretation, the evidence of things like quantum physics, where we start to see that observers play a role in the things that they observe. There's all sorts of ways you can interpret that. And people do argue over all the different kinds of interpretation. But once you're in the field of interpretation, you're actually out of science and you're in other realms. And science needs these other kinds of study to make sense of them, like philosophy or perhaps theology. And basically what I'm proposing is your best template for understanding the role of the observer in quantum physics might actually be the book of Genesis, which is about the fact that an observing mind stands at the foundation of the universe. And people, this is what's so interesting to me, is like people are kind of waking up in pop culture and in science to the need for some sort of philosophy or metaphysics or theology, something more than just physical materialism and scientific observation to understand the world. And what's really funny is that it's kind of like if I tomorrow woke up and I was like, oh, look, there's this thing in the sky, this sort of sparkly thing in the sky called Saturn. Like, I wonder what that's about, right? And I had never seen Saturn before, and I just sort of realized, oh, there's Saturn. My best route then would be to go to a physics textbook, right, and try to learn Newton's laws and figure out kind of bad paths that people had gone down and dead ends that I could avoid, and rely on the sum total of human knowledge. And then, I would avoid like basic mistakes like Empedocles' 4 elements. I couldn't come up with the best ideas on my own is basically what I'm saying. These guys, right, that are waking up, like these tech bros are sort of waking up to figure out, oh, there's a spiritual world. Like there's more than science can explain. We actually need some sort of abstract ideas of philosophy. And instead of going to like the equivalent of a physics textbook, which is the Bible, right? That's where we keep all of our knowledge about these spiritual ideas and questions. Instead of going there, they're like, sort of dabbling in Buddhism. Some of them think we're in a simulation. Some of them are talking about aliens that maybe came and sort of implanted. And these are sort of basic heresies. They're just basic, mistakes that people have made before. Right. And what I'm suggesting in this book is instead of that, right, instead of just, kindergarten mistakes that are really rudimentary, maybe pick up the Bible and use that as an interpretative mechanism, because it's actually better. It's a physics textbook.
Well, is there a reticence to do that in the scientific community, you think?
110%. Oh, yes. Reticence is a polite word. I think one reason for that is that there's a version of the Enlightenment story that I mentioned earlier on. There's a version of the Enlightenment story that's kind of true. And that version is, to do science, you do actually have to explain things without direct reference to God, because that's the definition almost of science, right? Yeah.
Well, okay. I wanted to ask you that question because I have said before, and I hold it loosely because theory, right? So prove me wrong, and I maybe, but that science by necessity limits itself to the material.
Yes, this is true.
Okay.
I mean, this is a major way that the Enlightenment idea got going, right? Is that to do science, you have to not come in with your preconceived notion of God. And you can't say God did it, because that's not a scientific explanation.
Yeah.
And that's still 100% true, right? And so that way of looking at things was so successful in the physical domain that it became possible to say, well, we don't need God to explain anything, right? That's what the guys like Pierre-Simon Laplace, again, French, said, like, oh, I have no need of that hypothesis, right? There's no reality in the world that I need to use to explain. And it became very important for scientists to defend that domain against people who genuinely did say, well, like, why can't we just say God did it? And the answer was, well, because there's this whole realm of understanding where we don't need to say God did it. We can actually figure it out on our own, and God might even want us to figure it out on our own. It's very exciting. And so then science had to erect these fences, right, against theology. But it was an artificial fence, right? That in truth, science exists cradled within metaphysical and theological assumptions. It's just the area within that field that you can sort of operate in without reference to God. And so now you come along and you say, okay, we've actually gotten out of the fences, right? We're sort of gone beyond into these other realms, like questions of observership and the soul or the psyche or the mind that require reference to God. And all these guys who are the heirs to that tradition are trained to raise up their defenses, to put the shield up, like, don't come in on my territory. And the answer to that is, like, you're already in our territory, brother. Like, this, you're already out in the other, it's just that you don't realize it because you think everything is your territory. And that's not really how that works,
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, this is the website for Spencer. It is a Substack site. So if you guys know Substack, it's substack.com @SpencerKlavan. You can catch up with him. Do you link to the podcast there, the Young Heretics podcast?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So if
you
want
can find Young Heretics there.
Yeah, you find that there. So here, I mean, geez, a lot of questions. But where do you, now I'll go with this one. What do you say to someone who is interested in science, who has maybe, been studying it with that mindset of, I can't let God into the equation, or I'm non-scientific, right? Unscientific. What do you say to that person who loves science, but is open to the idea of someone who has ordered the very thing that they're studying?
Yes, I would say this. Science is an enormous blessing and a great gift to the world. And it's so politically contested right now that there are a lot of people trying to undermine its proper role in our life. That on the one hand, you have the Dr. Fauci's who want to claim that their personal desire is science. Right? I am science. I represent the science. That's an insult to science and to its objectivity. And then on the other hand, you have guys reacting against Fauci who say science is all bunk. It's all a conspiracy. They're trying to pull one over on us. And that's an insult to science too, especially since the people who say it are usually talking into iPhone cameras that they wouldn't have if there weren't such a thing as science, right? So people who love science, I count myself one, but people who do science especially are under a lot of political pressure right now. And so it's natural to be defensive. But in order to stand against that pressure, science can't do it alone. You actually can't just prove scientifically that there's such a thing as objective truth, or that we are able to understand things like quantum gravity if we just work hard enough. That's not something you can prove from within science. And so you're going to need help. You're going to need allies. And you're already getting enlisted by various allies. You're getting enlisted for political projects. You're getting enlisted for pseudo-spiritualism and kind of neo-theology. Your real ally, your true friend, is your oldest friend, and that is the church. It's actually the church that has always been the best friend of science, and it's always been science that works best when it serves a grander vision of the world that is theological. And our theology in the West is the Judeo-Christian theology that produced science in the first place. So religion isn't trying to take away your science. We want to help you. And I actually think we need to help each other in this. Like there has to be a reunion of these two things because they're both under terrible assault. And if they're at war with one another, on top of that, we actually don't stand a chance.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to push back on one small idea here, and maybe it's just the way
Okay.
I was raised, which is different than the
Yeah.
way you were raised. I have heard preachers and sermons and seen in some books a really kind of anti-scientific bias, and I think it's because of that misperception that science rejects God, or I mean, maybe the perception that science rejects God.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, because I accept God, I reject science. And it's kind of, you know, this weird thing is like, well, okay, gravity, I get that one, you know. So it's kind of a pick and choose kind of thing. But what do you say to the Christians who may have an anti-science bias when really their faith could actually help them be good scientists, I would say?
I'm so glad you asked, because I really actually agree with you about this. I won't disagree in the slightest. And I actually talk about this in the book. I quote a sermon by Charles Spurgeon, who's one of my favorite preachers, but who gives, I think, a really misguided sermon where he says, all these kids are coming to me with this newfangled Darwinism, and they're asking me what Christianity's answer is to Darwinism. And my response is, Christianity doesn't need an answer to Darwinism. This is just the latest fad. It's like, you know, it's like some sort of pseudoscience or some sort of philosophy that men come up with, and the word of God stands forever. And all you got to do is just cling to the faith. And I saw a lot of that too when I was becoming a Christian. I think there's still a lot of that. Yeah. There's blame to go around on both sides, but really it is a defensive posture, right? It's a defensive crouch against the perception that what science teaches is openly hostile to religion and to the faith. Right. And to that, I can only say this. Your God is the God of truth, right? And truth, which is true, must be of God by definition. There's no such thing as a truth that can threaten your faith or your religion for the reason that your God made it all. It all belongs to him. And so if there are things that seem true to us that might raise questions and doubts about our faith, and if those things seem true to us honestly from the perception of the best evidence of our reason, then we need to grapple with that head on. We need to be looking right straight at that, because God's not trying to deceive us, and he didn't give us faulty reasons so that we would be tested again. Like, that's not how that works at all. He gave us reasons so that we would know him. And many people realize this, see the power and the truth of science, and then reject faith because people tell them that the Bible is sort of against this somehow.
Right.
Neither side of that exchange is winning right now. And the better route is to move confidently in the direction of the truth, in the faith that you will find God on the other side. I'll end with one quote that I really love. It's often attributed to Werner Heisenberg. He didn't quite say it in this way, but I love it this way. The quote is, "The first sip from the cup of science may make you an atheist, but when you drain the cups at the bottom, God is waiting for you on the other side." And I think Christians need to have faith in that, because God is big enough to wait for you on the other side.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. For every mile of road, there's 2 miles of ditch, and we need to fall. And either side of that, there is truth right down the middle. Love it, man. This is really good. This is enlightening, true enlightenment, I would say, Spencer. So appreciate that.
Pleasure.
Anything you want to add before I let you go? This is fun.
No, not at all. And I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. And just one more thing about the book. It's Light of the Mind, Light of the World, and it's on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And you can also find me for my sins on Twitter at Spencer Klavan, where I will also tweet the link to the book as well.
They call that X these days.
I'm so sorry. I know. I'm an old. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. I've been on that platform for. I've seen the old wars. You know.
Yeah, well, when you get the links for this interview, it'll say Twitter/X. It's like.
Yeah. There you go.
All right. Appreciate you guys out there watching. If you know someone who is scientifically inclined, curious, maybe you struggle with some of this, this is a perfect time to hit that share button. And if you haven't liked, followed, or subscribed, I would invite you to do that. You'll get more notifications of wonderful, insightful interviews just like this one. And again, Light of the Mind, Light of the World by Spencer Klavan, available wherever you get books. Appreciate you guys being here. We'll see you again next time here on Life Today Live.
No man comes to the Father